Hi, human geographers. We are on topic 1.6, which is about scales of analysis. Just like a lot of the other topics that we've covered so far this unit, this topic is a foundational skill that you will have to be able to use through the whole entire unit. And so your objectives here are for you to be able to define scales of analysis used by geographers and be able to explain what scales of analysis reveal. So let's get into this. You can think about scales of analysis as zooming in or zooming out on a map or a piece of data in order to tell a story. And so think about, if we were to zoom all the way out, right? The largest scale of analysis is going to be global. Then it'll move down to regional, state, country, or national. Those all mean the same exact things. Sub-state, which is what we think of in the US as states. County, city, or local. And then finally, census tract. So on your guided notes, you have these boxes to fill in. So if I'm all the way zoomed out, that's going to be a global scale, whereas if I'm all the way zoomed in, this is going to be a census tract scale. Now, keep in mind, this can be a map or some sort of graphic piece of data that we are changing the scale to look at. We're zooming in or we're zooming out to look at. So this is one of the most kind of easily confused things in human geo because there are also two types of scales in maps. There are small scale maps and large scale maps. And what you need to do to remember is tell yourself opposites. So you can see here small scale maps show large areas. And they're called small scale because they show small amounts of data. So, for instance, the most zoomed out map here you can see is the national map of the United States. Okay, so this is the smallest scale map in relation to the rest that we are looking at. Also, when we're talking about the scale of maps, you should look at what the actual scale says that is labeled on the map. So map scale can be described in a few different ways. Verbally, which you can see 1 inch equals 1,485 miles, for instance. That means 1 inch on this map here is going to be equivalent to that many miles in real life. Scale can also be shown on a map by a representative fraction, right? So this is, 1 over 94 million. And then finally, it can be shown graphically, which is, this arrow's kind of in the way, but it looks like this. So, from this notch to this notch is going to, represent that 585 miles, for instance. Now, something that you need to notice while we're looking at these differences in scale of maps is that the smaller scale map has the largest number, right? And that's because it's showing the largest area and we do not have a lot of data coming out of that map. Okay, so now let's look at the large scale map in relation. So a large scale map, again, opposite, is going to show a small area. It is all the way zoomed in. And since it is so zoomed in, it's going to show us a large amount of data. So if you look, right, this is the smallest scale map. Then we zoom in a little bit, and then we zoom in further. So we're increasing the scale, right? And then finally, This is the largest scale map because it shows the city of Atlanta and the highways that connect within that city. And so this is a smaller area than our initial small scale map, which makes it large scale, right? There's a lot of data. I can see these highways on this map that were not visible here. And if you look at the numbers, right, that I was talking about, you can see that these are very small numbers in relation to these numbers up here, right? So the large scale map is only showing 1.3 million on that representational fraction. And you can see 1 inch here is equal to 20 miles, right? Whereas on the small scale map, 1 inch was equal to 1,485 miles. So to kind of sum things up, right? There are two different things that we talk about when we talk about scale, right? We talk about this scale of analysis, which is this map showing me a global scale of analysis or is it showing me a census tract scale of analysis? Then we also need to ask ourselves, is this a small scale map or a large scale map? Right? If it's a small scale map, I'm not going to be able to see a lot of data, a lot of detailed information. I'm going to see a larger area that's very zoomed out. And my fractions and my numbers that are actually labeled on the map are going to be larger, right? So opposites. Whereas that large scale map is going to show a very small area and it's going to show a lot of data and the numbers are going to be smaller. So let me give you some examples of this, right? So this map is a global scale. You see, I can see every single country in the world, all of the continents, except for Antarctica, which is oftentimes left out of maps. But the scale of analysis is national. And this is because even though I'm looking at the whole globe, right, it is being broken down by country lines, right, or boundaries. And so global scale maps are really useful, even if they're showing a national scale of analysis, to compare and contrast countries all around the world, right? But this can be problematic because, for instance, let's look at what this map is showing. Share of the population living in extreme poverty in 2017. And you can see the darker color red, the more poverty, the lighter color yellow, the less poverty. And so we basically, like the United States, for instance, are sitting at 0% of our citizens or people living in the US living in extreme poverty. Well, I'm sure you know, and I know, that's not true, right? That's not truly representative of the level of poverty in the United States because this is all relative. Right? It's the same thing in these countries with really high levels of poverty. There are very rich people that live in Madagascar and are not living on a dollar 90 per day, right? Or India, for example. There are wealthy people in those countries. So, this global scale map and this national level of analysis kind of leave out some really important aspects of this piece of data, and it doesn't necessarily help me understand the nuances or the more complicated factors of extreme poverty around the world. So now let's zoom in a little bit, right? And let's look at this is a national scale map, right? You can see the whole country of the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, but it is a sub-state level of analysis, right? So if this was a national scale of analysis, then it would just tell me that right here you can see 0% of people in the US live in extreme poverty. But this is a subset, a sub-state level of analysis. So now I'm looking at the percentage of people in poverty for the United States. And this is specifically in 2018, so it's a little bit more updated data. And so you can see the darker color purple is the higher the percentage of people in that state living in poverty, and the lighter color is the this means that less people in that state are living in poverty. And so if you turn your attention towards the map and really point out the places in the US that have the most or the highest rates of poverty, right? This kind of section of southern states, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, are kind of the region of the United States with the highest amount of poverty, right? Kentucky and West Virginia are also in there, as well as New Mexico, you can see, right? But if I even kind of do if I kind of think regionally, right, instead of just looking at one country at a time, I would say that the region of the US that has the highest rates of poverty is the South, right? All of these are one of those darker shades of purple. So this map tells us something different than our previous map, right? And so that's one of our major kind of objectives here that you need to think about. And I kind of put this at the very bottom of your notes page. Different scales of maps or data reveal variations in these spatial patterns. Right? So, again, if I just look at this map, then I may mistakenly think, oh, there's 0% poverty in the United States. Wham, bam, I'm done, right? That's way too simple. So that's why it's important to look at different scales when you are trying to determine a spatial pattern. So let's look at another scale. So this is an example. This is still a national scale map, right? We still see the whole country of the United States. However, it's broken down into a county level of analysis. So this is every single county in the United States. And you can see that the key has changed here, right? So the darker color purple is now 30% or more people, or I'm sorry, poverty rate in those counties. Okay. So again, does the trend hold true, right? And for the most part, it does, right? These countries right here had the highest rates of poverty on our previous sub state scale of analysis map. But you can see the data is different, right? If I were to zoom in even closer on this map to look at Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, excuse me, you can see that there are certain counties that are really plagued by poverty. And then there's other counties that are in this kind of lightest blue color that seem to have less than 10% poverty rate. And so, again, this is going to tell us more information because we're zooming in closer, and the scale is going to change the data that we're looking at. So again, if I put these, side by side, different scales. So this national scale, which is a sub-state scale of analysis, and then this national scale, but a county level of analysis, they're showing variations in that data. So now let's go down to the local scale. And so this is a local scale map, and it is a local scale level of analysis. And the neighborhoods in Cincinnati are basically broken down into census tracts. And you do need to know what a census tract is. It is the smallest scale of analysis that we can really look at. It comprises anywhere from 1,000 to 8,000 people. But the goal in creating census tracts is to make sure that they have a similar amount of population in all of them, right? So you want kind of all of your census tracts to have about the same amount of people included. And so this is, when we talk about neighborhoods in Cincinnati, we're basically talking about census tracts. And so I kind of am continuing on with this theme about poverty, right? So if I look at these two local scale maps, um, there's actually a spatial pattern here, right? And this is the highest median household incomes. So we're not looking necessarily at poverty now, we're looking at household income. In Cincinnati are mostly on the east side, right? You have North Avondale, which is pretty central, and then my face here is covering up Sailor Park. But these are kind of the 10 wealthiest neighborhoods in Cincinnati, right? And then you can kind of contrast that and look at the lowest median household incomes in Cincinnati, and you can see the majority of them are in central Cincinnati, right? Like downtown, over the Rhine, the West End. As well as some kind of over here on what we would start to call the west side, right? Like Lower Price Hill. So again, when I zoom in closer here, right, and I'm looking at a larger scale map, I'm looking at a local level of analysis, right? The data changes. Um, it's very, very hard to see kind of the data down here for Cincinnati in Hamilton County. But you can see it's definitely not one of the darkest color purple, right? But here, these are the neighborhoods in our city that would classify as that darkest color purple. So something that I skipped, and we're going to talk about this more with following kind of the following topics, is the regional scale of analysis. So if I go all the way back, and you can kind of look up at your notes here, to this graphic that I use to describe the zooming in and zooming out, right? Global is the most zoomed out. And then the kind of next step of zooming in would be regional. And that's what we're talking about here. And so I pulled data and maps here from specifically the continent of Africa, since we are looking at the US a lot. And so you can see here, this is a regional level of analysis, although very similarly to our other maps that we looked at this video, this is, it's more than a national scale map. It's actually a continental scale map, right? This is the whole continent of Africa. And so we're really zooming in here on this specific region, which is made up of kind of these Central African countries. Now, this region is technically Eastern Africa, and these countries are technically Western Africa. However, all of these qualify as sub Saharan African countries. They're all below the Sahara Desert. Right? In Sudan, it kind of cuts through, but we would still call that a sub-Saharan African country. So after explaining that, right, I'm looking at a region in sub-Saharan Africa with the largest forcibly displaced populations. And so basically what this means is these are people that, these are countries that have the largest numbers of people that have been forced to leave their homes or their countries of origin due to things like natural disasters or violence and war. And so you can see when I'm looking at this regional scale of analysis, right, it's beneficial to look at all of these countries as a region themselves because they're going to share a lot of similar characteristics. Now, how would a geographer use, a regional scale of analysis? That's why I put this graph up here, right? So if you look at the graph, it says maternal mortality in Ethiopia and sub-Saharan Africa. And so Ethiopia, this Solid green line is a national scale of analysis. So, how many women are dying due to childbirth? That's the number up here per you can see 100,000 over time. And so I can see in Ethiopia, that number went from close to 800 women in 2005 per 100,000 live births, all the way down, you can see, to less than 400 in 2015. So that's a huge development in Ethiopia, which is also one of these countries you can see that has the largest forcibly displaced population. Now, I can compare that national rate of maternal mortality to a regional rate of maternal mortality. So the rate for all of sub-Saharan Africa, this is all of the countries that are south of the Sahara Desert. You can see it started a little lower than Ethiopia's in 2005, probably around, the high 700s. And it has also been decreasing over time, but it still remains much higher than that in Ethiopia itself. So, again, when I talk about changing the scales of analysis, it reveals different variations in spatial data, right? If I look at a national scale level of analysis, I'm like, wow, Ethiopia is doing so much better in terms of maternal mortality. But when I compare that to the regional scale of analysis, I can see, wow, Ethiopia actually is kind of this major change within their region. So, kind of tying all of this up, right? What do you need to know? You need to know that scales of analysis are used by geographers. So you have to be able to look at a map or a piece of data and identify that scale of analysis. And you also need to explain what scales of analysis reveal, which is that, when I'm looking at different maps or different sets of data, by changing the scale, zooming in or zooming out, I am going to end up with different data. So, like always, please have questions ready to ask me when I see you in class.